So a few words about the context to remind us that we are in the seventh meeting in our series dedicated to Jewish tradition in the Anthropocene, Jewish tradition in the environmental crisis. And why is that? It's because it's under the umbrella of the Beit Midrash of Jewish thought, and there are a few topics that Jewish thought needs to address. And one of them is the environmental crisis, the world that we are living. So we are actually opening kind of a door into this discussion and to look for anchors, places that we can go deeper. So we had a few meetings until now, an introduction, a general one, talk about how Jewish traditions encounter environmental issues, meeting a little bit the different aspect, the spectrum of approaches towards the nature from anthropocentrism to what we can call biocentrism. And I think here we have a very interesting opportunity. This meeting with Professor Michael Marder, which I think occupy a very unique position within this discourse and in a meeting point between philosophy, between mysticism and environmentalism, if we can call it that. I think we can trace a movement from continental philosophy, from Derrida. I think his text, Eating Well, is very important point of departure. Jean-Luc Nancy, Lucy Rigaret, which from her point of view, philosophy needs to approach the world from a feminist point of view, no? Contra the phallocentrism. And I think Michael is presenting a philosophical approach or theoretical approach that looks not from anthropocentric point of view, looks at the world from the point of view of vegetation, which is, I think it's a very challenging idea. And it's also a connection between the Zohar, which also remind us it's kind of Walter Benjaminian kind of connection, which is a very unique one. So I thank you very much, Michael, for participating in our study. We are really anxious to study from you, and we really appreciate your participation. And we are leaving the floor to you. We'll have a discussion about 15 minutes, and then we'll have the possibility to ask questions and remarks. So thank you again, Michael, and welcome.
Yes, thank you, Zev, for these remarks. I'm really especially delighted to be with all of you in this context of studying the relation between the Jewish tradition and the Anthropocene, because for several years now I have been very closely studying the book of Zohar, which quite recently or relatively recently came out in a complete critical edition in English from Stanford University Press. So 12 big volumes like this, very highly recommended if you're interested in a really in-depth approach to it. Of course, combined also with the original text, quite challenging, written in medieval Aramaic with some admixtures of Ladino. So the sources themselves are difficult, both linguistically and in terms of ideas, but very rewarding once you get into their logic. And I would start by saying that it is not only a Jewish relation to the Anthropocene and the environmental crisis that we can actually glean from these quite old texts, but a much more positive reconstruction of ecology itself based on a mystical Jewish perspective. So I'm not only interested in the obviously very overwhelming and urgent notion of the environmental crisis, the Anthropocene, and how to understand it from diverse perspectives, but also in this more positive task of reconstructing ecology from the Jewish mystical point of view, which is the broader project I'm engaged in. So what I'm going to present today is a reading of the reading by Zohar of a very famous passage from the book of Genesis, namely the one that precedes the original sin of Adam and Eve, the prohibition from eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, right? And so there is something strange going on in at least on the at first glance, there's something strange going on in the mystical Jewish tradition interpreting this famous passage from the Hebrew Bible, which is that it takes this prohibition of eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil and treats it with what I would call strategic minimalism. So what Zohar does is it cuts the injunction halfway. And the biblical injunction is, it starts with these words, from every tree of the garden you are free to eat. You will eat from every tree of the garden. They take this positive injunction and stop it right there, disrupting the semantic and hermeneutical flow between Genesis 2:16 and the following verses. And so they cut out this positive bit, separating it from the rest of the text. And as a result, the prohibition morphs into a permission because it starts in this positive way. From every tree of the garden, you are free to eat. And Zohar really takes it, the writers of Zohar take it literally and say that according to the biblical text, everything was permitted to him, to Adam, if eaten in oneness. Yiḥudah, in oneness, right? So there's an absolute permission to eat from every tree of the garden on the condition that everything is taken in oneness, yiḥudah. So on the face of it, the exegetical thrust of Zohar does the opposite of what it recommends. It really breaks the biblical narrative while advocating for a holistic understanding of the command. It cuts this positive bit while advocating eating and understanding and grasping in oneness. But the point is that Adam and Eve are forewarned not about what can be taken and appropriated from their environs, but about the how of the taking. So it's not what they can eat and what they cannot eat in this first prefiguration of the kosher and the unkosher, let's say. It's not what can be eaten and what cannot be eaten, but how one should be eating. Knowledge, which is the sublimation of digestion, and which is literally present in its original form in eating, must strive toward the unity, yiḥudah, of existence, of life as such, of life and death, the unity of life as such, the unity of life and death, and finally the unity of life and knowledge. In other words, mystical knowledge must be of necessity ecological, right? And I would briefly pause here, cutting the flow of my own presentation in order to contextualize this issue in broader terms, because here we have a small fragment of the Jewish tradition talking about the relation between eating and knowing, already prefigured in the biblical text. Eating, what is forbidden is eating this fruit from the tree of knowledge, specifically of good and evil. But then we can also see how this morphs and mutates in the subsequent Christian tradition. For instance, with the practice of the Eucharist, the ingestion of the divine body and blood of Jesus, and its interpretation by Augustine, for instance. We can, especially, I don't have much time now, but in the Q&A, we can talk about these other instances of a much more spiritual approach to digestion and physiological processes that seem to be completely material and bodily. In philosophy, Western philosophy proper, especially in the 19th century, we can think about Hegel and Nietzsche, who take very seriously this physiological basis of knowing in various bodily processes, namely in digestion, and how that is sublimated into much more abstract forms of knowing. And even outside the Western fold, if we go to much older traditions, for instance, in Indian thought, the Vedic and the Brahmanic traditions, we can reconstruct a whole ontology of eating as a practice of perfection, as a practice of cooking the world, and as a sacrificial practice, right? Not necessarily the sacrifice meant for the gods, but actually even what one ingests and eats is already a sacrifice to fire, to Agni, to the inner fire of digestion that continues the work of perfecting the foodstuffs that is undertaken by the cook, and prior to the cook by the sun itself that ripens the fruit and plants and so on. So a very rich multicultural, cross-cultural heritage of thought is involved here, not just the wisdom of Zohar. But Zohar then continues, because it becomes a little bit, what is strange and mystical here is the question of how is it possible to eat in oneness? Because eating seems to be, by definition, an act of analysis. Even before breaking down the foodstuffs in one's digestive apparatus, the very biting into food, into an object, is already analyzing it to bits, right? So how is it possible to eat in oneness, in synthesis, as it were? Again, plants already are looming on our horizon because, of course, they are photosynthesizing. They derive their energy at least above ground, in their above ground portions, by opening up their organs to the sun and by receiving this mode of alimentation through photosynthesis, precisely a synthesis and not an analysis. While the rest of what they need is received through osmosis below ground, water, minerals, and so on, right? So Zohar gives us a little bit more on this point, because it then contends that the wisdom of the forefathers of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob consists in a special know-how of abiding by the flow of divine emanations received as a whole, knowing without analyzing reality into bits. So this is what eating in oneness means. It's a special kind of knowledge, first a bodily knowledge, but not only, obviously, that knows reality without analyzing it into bits, without fragmenting it, without treating it as a set of discrete objects to be appropriated and grasped and assimilated to the faculty of understanding, which is like this big sublime stomach of the mind itself, right? So Zohar, in the exegesis of this biblical passage, writes, they, the forefathers, all ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil and endured. Achalu vechayu, right? So, or more literally, ate and endured is the translation, the Matt translation from the Stanford edition, but literally they ate and they lived. So they were able to know in a way that is consistent with life, with Chaim, the way that maintains and dispenses life to the knower and the known, where the two may refer to the same living being, for instance, in the case of self-knowledge, right? And I can say then a few more words about Zoharic or Jewish mystical self-knowledge centered on another interpretation of a passage from Genesis of the first call to Abraham to leave his native land, Lech Lecha, right? But so what is important here is that it is not forbidden to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And in fact, Zohar says, all the forefathers ate from that tree, and they were not punished with death as Adam and Eve were. They ate and they lived, because they ate in such a way, they understood and knew in such a way that was consistent with life itself. And remember, if you recall the initial biblical story, in the middle of the Garden of Eden, there are two trees, actually, the tree of knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life, right? So eating in oneness, eating in such a way that one is able to live after ingesting the fruit of the tree of knowledge, is eating it as if it's the tree of life. In fact, as we'll see later on, what Zohar will teach us is that the two trees are one and the same tree. And to separate them, to separate the tree of knowledge from the tree of life, is already to fall into the trap of the original sin. And you see here, the important point is that we're not just talking about ancient texts. We are maybe trying to understand the deep roots of a contemporary tendency that continues and intensifies this separation between knowledge and life. because most of the apparatus of knowing that is centered, at least on the Western technoscience, is precisely the one that does not eat in oneness. It's precisely the one that separates knowledge from life and treats life and the living as the objects of knowing, and therefore deadens them ahead of time, right? So, but I'm running a little bit ahead of myself, so we'll proceed a little bit more systematically. If Adam and Eve received the death sentence as their punishment for the original sin, among all the other punishments that were meted out to them by God, it is because of how they took the knowledge that the tree yielded, internally transforming it into a tree of death. So when you don't treat the tree of knowledge as the tree of life, you necessarily eat from it as from the tree of death. Divine punishment is not an external punishment imposed onto Adam and Eve. They punished themselves by treating the tree of knowledge of good and evil not as a tree of life and therefore as a tree of death. By eating that fruit, they already ingested death itself, mortality and its knowledge. So here's the relevant passage from Zohar. This is, for those who are interested, this is Book 1, Section 35b. All from volume 1 of the Stanford edition. I quote, "But this tree is a tree of death. When you don't eat in oneness, then the tree of knowledge is the tree of death. Whoever takes it alone dies, for he has taken deadly poison. So, on the day you eat from it, you will surely die." This is a quote from the biblical text. "For he separates saplings." Pareish nitiin. End quote. The punishment meted out by God, therefore, merely reiterates the consequences of dicing reality into manageable chunks to be eaten up and assimilated by our faculty of understanding, scientific and philosophical analysis, and so on. One's own death is conceivable in its finality only on the condition that one sees oneself as one such freestanding, separate, and therefore destructible piece of reality. Right? So taking everything in oneness means also taking oneself in oneness with everything outside. This is the ecological thrust of Jewish mystical knowledge, right? And this is where the interpretation of Lech Lecha, go forth, the commandment given by God to Abraham to leave his native land, comes in, because under the lens of Zohar, what it means, and you know, the interesting point is not only in the Jewish mystical tradition, but in the medieval Christian and Islamic mystical traditions, there is a kind of tendency that I'm tempted to call hyperliteralism. So all those apparently allegorical readings are actually readings of the text to the letter. So when the writers of Zohar read these words in the Hebrew Bible, Lech Lecha, translated into English as "go forth," as the commandment to Abram, they say, but wait a moment. This is a verb in the reflexive. It literally means go unto yourself. So the commandment given to Abraham is a commandment of self-knowing without a given destination. Remember, that destination is not shown until Abram actually arrives at Mount Moriah, the mount that means he has shown. It's not so. The showing is self-reflexive, right? Go, leave your native land, leave the certainties of your everyday life, means a kind of embarking on an inner journey towards self-knowing, right? Self-knowing and, as Zohar intimates, also knowing and seeing oneself as one with the outside reality. Now, Zohar's reference to the separation of saplings in the passage I've read alludes to the Babylonian Talmud, that's Tractate Haggadah 14b, where of the four rabbis who entered an orchard, Pardes, which is recalls the Garden of Eden, paradise, only Rabbi Akiva survives by virtue of not engaging in the practice of severing the saplings, kitzetz banitiyot. Although plant saplings can, under certain conditions, lead a life independent from the mother plant, the Talmudic expression implies the killing of human children. In turn, the sapling at stake in Zohar is Shekhinah, right? The ultimate, the last, emanation of God who is the closest to the earth, the closest to this world that we also inhabit. The lowest of the Sfirot, or the divine emanations, representing the tree of knowledge of good and evil, or, as Zohar puts it, a branch of those branches planted by the Blessed Holy One when he created the world. Right? So eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil is already getting in touch with Shekhinah, but the risk that one runs is taking it, or taking her, usually coded in the feminine. All of these emanations, Sfirot, are coded in particular genders that can also change depending on the context and relation to other emanations. So the danger and the risk is grasping this final, last, lowest divine emanation separately from the rest of the emanations. Right? That risk of separation is already there in the very scheme of the spherotic tree of the divine emanations that Zohar works with, as the rest of the Kabbalist tradition does as well. Right? So this branch of those branches contains nothing but emptiness and death when cleaved from the flow of emanations it is meant to receive. So Shekhinah by herself, as Zohar time and again emphasizes, is empty. It is divine emptiness or divine poverty, capable of containing or receiving the rest of the emanations. So taking that emptiness by itself without the rest of the emanations is really ingesting nothing, ingesting a void, and therefore partaking of death. Right? The formality of abstract knowledge is a reflection of Shekhinah's emptiness hypostatized, which leads to the perishing of the lowest part of the Judaic cosmic tree, that is the tree of Sephirot, the tree of divine emanations. So the next question arises, who is Shekhinah? Who is Shekhinah? And here, I think, at least in my reading of Zohar more broadly, Shekhinah is the closest that we come to naming something like ecology in the Jewish tradition, right? Though an emanation of God, she is a figure of emptiness and poverty, as I've mentioned. She is the withdrawal of God, which is still God or still in God, and which makes existence possible, right? In commentary on Noah, Shekhinah appears in the guise of a cistern or a well of emptiness and potential fullness that belong together, that co-belong in the indeterminate nexus of giving and taking. So the usual scheme of a separation between passivity and activity, emptiness and fullness completely breaks down there, right? It is giving and taking, or giving, taking, passive, active at the same time. And so I quote from the exegesis of Noah in Zohar. This is book 160a. A cistern is empty, unflowing, while a well, be'er, bubbles with water. Yet all is one sight. Again, all is one sight, returning to this oneness of all as to be taken. The sight embracing the poor is called cistern, possessing nothing of its own, only what is deposited there. Who is that? Dalet, the letter Dalet, end quote. So when sephirotic dynamics work as they should, emptiness and fullness, a well and a cistern, are one and the same. All is one side, atar chad. But when Shekhinah is grasped through knowledge of good and evil, apart from the flow of emanations that she receives, knowers come to possess something or someone possessing nothing of its own. Right? And this is what our abstract knowledge and even technoscientific knowledge usually does. It comes to possess, it grasps nothing at all. It grasps only the dead and death, and therefore can spread only what it grasps all around it, all around the world. These knowers are not simply empty-handed. They eat up nothingness, right? It's like eating up nothingness. This is the punishment meted out for the original sin. And therefore, they assimilate emptiness. They assimilate, incorporate devastating poverty and death. The letter Dalet signifies Shekhinah because she is Dala, or Dala, poor. So the text presents its readers with two disparate options, two approaches to poverty and emptiness that cardinally affect the relation of knowledge and life. On the one hand, empty knowledge receives the receiving alone, while rejecting the precious content of life, which only persists in a unity with the forms it is received by. The formalism of knowing, the abstraction, the very separation of form from content belong in that kind of an option. The choice is between a denying and a giving withdrawal. The withdrawal is always there. God needs to withdraw and still be God in order to open up the space for existence, but the choice is between a withdrawal that is a giving withdrawal that opens up space, or rather gives room to existence, or a withdrawal that denies existence, that suffocates, that leaves a vacuum, right? Not only on the outside again, but especially inside. Poverty can be as much the poverty of abstraction as that of an absenting that makes room for existence. It is the second option that resonates outside the Jewish tradition with the Platonic chora, the receptive embrace of a place, not to be mistaken with the arid abstraction of space. Everything that Zohar will convey on the subject of the welcoming opening of Shekhinah, with its ineluctable absence that allows for the presence of beings, belongs within this embrace. Belongs within this embrace. Now, a living, vivifying knowledge is not sundered from the source of life, whereas the dead and deadening knowledge erects a dam across the river of life and marks its own domain on the arid terrain of abstraction that comes through in the aftermath. The spherotic tree, this tree of divine emanations, sphirot, channels the flux of vitality to Shekhinah, which in her fully feminine divine form ought to be taken as a part of a vast unfolding rather than a freestanding product. So when we understand reality as discrete objects, as products devoid of a process that brought them about and that continues in and through them, then we ingest this empty abstract knowledge. The flux, in turn, waters the entire cosmic tree and the tree of knowledge of good and evil in particular. I quote, "The tree of which we have spoken was watered, flourished, and rejoiced. As is said," this is from Genesis 2:10, "a river issues from Eden to water the garden." The garden, this is woman, the river entering her, watering her, and all was one, Chad, while from there below is division, pirudah, as is written, from there it divides, veipared, right? End quote. Initially, the tree of life and that of knowledge are one and the same tree. The division of primordial unity is as much an upshot of human behavior, taking and eating the fruit from the latter tree in such a way that the growth and development leading up to its ripening are obscured, as it is the product of cosmico-ontological scheme, in keeping with which, I quote, "whoever takes it, this tree by itself, takes it together with hordes below, embraced by it, takes idolatry, murder, and exposing nudity," end quote. Remarkably, the ungluing of Shekhinah from other upper sphirot, of knowledge from life, etc., coincides with a mix, not only of good and evil, so the tree of good and evil, you cannot actually separate, even though it's taken in separation, you cannot distinguish good from evil. Coincides with a mix, not only of good and evil, but also of the multitudes below Shekhinah, unaware of their interdependence with one another, and with the ever-coming flow of vitality, which they to some extent also express and stimulate. We can then talk about not only flows that derive from above, but stimulation of those flows from below. This is the remarkable, I would say, anti-metaphysical gesture of the at least medieval Jewish mystical tradition that does not only picture divinity as this immanent continuity of the flow, but actually gives human beings and perhaps all living beings the role in stimulating the circulation of this flow, in allowing it not to be wasted and dispensed below, but to reascend and to go up again through righteous acts, through ethics, through good deeds. Right? And on the contrary, a close integration of the cosmic ontological scheme with ethical conduct is a staple feature of the Kabbalistic worldview. The world is not firmly established without righteousness, right? This is what I've just been mentioning. The world is not firmly established without righteousness, without this figure of the tzaddik. Tzaddik yesod olam. The righteous is the foundation of the world, right? Again, taken literally, as symbolized by the sphira yesod, which is directly above Shekhinah. Yesod means foundation. So the foundation is nothing founded in the objective or cosmological sense. Foundation is ethics. Hence, the entire philosophy of Levinas flows from this ethics as first philosophy. To sum up, the rift between Shekhinah and the other Sphirot that opens up as a result of this unwise eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil means at least four things. So I will go one by one by way of summarizing. So, first, the flow of emanations or cosmic energies, divine energies, is interrupted. It's not completely continuous. It is and can be interrupted. Second, the lower branches of the world tree are no longer in touch with its celestial roots. So if you imagine this entire scheme of the spherotic tree, it's a tree with its roots pointing up, right? It's rooted above, and then the entire flow descends until it is stimulated by righteous acts below. Third, the symmetrical bilateral top-down and bottom-up causality, as it is above, so it is below, no longer works as it should. And fourth, what is grasped by means of knowledge, disconnected from life, is pure emptiness and death, regardless of the object that is grasped. It is always translatable into pure emptiness and death, because ultimately this is what is ingested here. And the four aspects of the rift that I have just sketched out very briefly and schematically reinforce one another, while also deepening it and repeating the initial separation. So it's a kind of downward spiral. The more it proceeds, the more separation happens, the deeper it becomes, until we reach our 21st century with everything that follows from this. Among a slew of its effects of this separation, there are not only the ontological and the epistemological, but also the ethical ones. The formal and abstract knowledge that remains after this traumatic event is cut off from life and from righteousness. So it's a knowledge without any relation to ethics, without any relation to good, despite being a fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The first knowledge is the knowledge of ethics, and yet this cutting of knowledge from the tree of life also cuts it from ethics as well. It is the kind of knowledge that is both dead and unethical, dead because unethical, not to mention deadening as far as life is concerned. Now, we could really spend hours on this, but I'm aware of the passage of time, so let me there are other very rich imagery that Zohar presents us with in terms of this empty, abstract, poor knowledge cut off from life. Obviously, it is dead and formal, but it is also the knowledge of the night. It's the kind of night that is detached from the day. Right? Because as we know, the diurnal nocturnal cycles are necessarily imply this connection between darkness and light, just as life and death are also connected. So the knowledge that is taken in separation introduces, despite its illusion of a total illumination, of the enlightenment, as we would say in the modern European context, it is the knowledge of the night, and of a night that is actually separate from the day that would follow it otherwise. And it is the knowledge of the West. This actually took me a while to realize, because for those of you who have a mental picture of the spherotic tree, you will know that the Kabbalistic tradition, especially in Zohar, maps different parts of the world onto this tree. And I mentioned that the tree is rooted above, the portion below is Shekhinah, But the portion below is not the south, because usually on our compasses, on our kind of in our orientation in space, we think that the north is above and the south is below. In the spherotic orientation, what is below is the west, and what is above is the east, right? So everything derives from the east. All the three sphirot that are unknowable, the highest ones, like Ein Sof or the infinite, that is the east of the spherotic tree, just as the sun rises in the east, of course, right? So the main orientation is the orient precisely. It's not the north. And the knowledge that is centered on Shekhinah alone, cut off from the rest of the spherotic tree, is the knowledge of the West, of the declining sun, of the region of death, therefore, right? So this is important to keep in mind, just to literally orient ourselves in the scheme that is as much conceptual as it is spatial and geographical within this kind of cosmic or divine geography. Now, the other feature, the other positive feature of negative death-bearing knowledge disconnected from life is the godlike creativity it bestows upon whoever eats of its fruit, right? So this is not just a knowledge that is empty, and its emptiness itself becomes creative. It becomes productive, in a sense. Seducing Eve, the serpent utters, according to Rabbi Yosef's reading of the Hebrew Bible and of the Midrash Bereshit Rabbah, I quote, "With this tree, the Blessed Holy One created the world. Eat from it, and you will really be like Elohim, God knowing good and evil," right? So, according to Zohar, these are the words of the serpent, the tempting words. You will become like God, right? So, this empty knowledge, this death-bearing knowledge, does have a dimension of creativity, of almost godlike creativity to it. And the serpent continues, "For so it is, Elohim is its name, the tree of knowledge of good and evil." And Rabbi Yehuda adds, "Eat from it and you will be creating worlds," right? Eat from it and you will be creating worlds. So if the tree is Shekhinah, who bears one of the names of God, Elohim, then eating her fruit is eating something of God, ingesting divine essence, and moreover, separating one name of God, the tetragrammaton, from another, Elohim, the living God from a polysemic emanation or fruit, right? So this also enters into this curious dialogue across traditions with the Eucharist, which in the Christian tradition is also, of course, eating or ingesting the body of God, right? In the spirit of Neoplatonism, the serpent insinuates that partaking of God, Adam and Eve would also become creators. That is, their knowledge and world-making, their contemplation and doing, theory and practice would be one and the same. But plucking the fruit from the tree, segregating knowledge from life, culminates in the reverse of what the serpent promises. The act drives a wedge between being and knowing, right? To treat knowledge as a tool, even as a tool of world creation, to instrumentalize it is already to fall far short of God in an attempt to digest, to break down, and assimilate the fruit. Because in the divine act of creation, of course, synthesis and analysis, theory and practice, contemplation and doing are one and the same, right? So again, take it in oneness. What does it mean, eating in oneness? It is this nearly impossible, it seems to us, unity of synthesis and analysis, of theory and action, right? That approximates really the act of divine, the act and the contemplation of divine creation. Assuming that Adam and Eve were endowed with God's world-creating potency, the world, or the worlds in the plural, that they would make would be unlivable and ephemeral, formal models in line with empty and abstract knowledge. They would be pale reflections of divine experimentation, of God's play before creation with the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, spelling out the contents and the structures of possible worlds. So in the Zohar, God is this divine child before the creation of this world. And I will quote just to give you a taste of how it sounds in the translation of Zohar. Quote, "When the Blessed Holy One wished to fashion the world, all the letters were hidden. For 2,000 years before creating the world, the Blessed Holy One contemplated them and played with them. As he verged on creating the world, all the letters presented themselves before him from the last to the first, right? So, like a divine child, God plays with different combinations of letters that create different ephemeral worlds that fall apart before, for 2,000 years before creating this world that more or less endures, right? Now, the discrepancy between knowledge and life is not for all that a mere division. It is an exile of humanity and of the rest of creation from life. This is what expulsion from the Garden of Eden really means. It's an exile from life. Exile is understood in Zohar as the muteness of the living. When Eve took the fruit, she peeled life away from death, the voice from speech. I quote, "For voice is never separate from speech, and whoever separates voice from speech turns dumb, speechless. Who is silent? Praise of David, who turns silent in exile, begluta, begalut in Hebrew, begluta in Aramaic, voiceless, right? So it's an exile, separation of voice from speech, each of them referring to particular sfirot, right? And so this newly acquired knowledge exiles human beings from life. Another way of understanding the environmental crisis is that it is our and the planet's exile from life. Still before the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden, and definitely before the political exiles that have peppered the history of the Jewish people and have been assigned theological, if not metaphysical, significance. Exiled from life, we go on living, surviving ourselves, right? This is the strange condition, and Zeev mentioned Benjamin before. I think this would come very close to a Benjaminian line of thinking. Exiled from life, we go on living, we survive ourselves. As if already dead, we survive ourselves. In the same breath, God is exiled from herself or from himself when the Sefirah Shechina comes unglued from the other 9 Sefirot. So the exile is not only the condition of creation, let alone of human beings only, but it's also the condition of God. And this is the really poignant, I think, feature of the Jewish tradition, to say that God, him or herself, is in exile. This event in divine history, this rupture in the spherotic economy of God, is caused from below by human actions militating against life. And so the meaning of exile also needs to be reassessed in the context of what the Aramaic gluta and the Hebrew galut are saying. Legalot means simultaneously to exile and to expose. Exile is exposure also. Just as the objectifying knowledge untethered to life mercilessly exposes beings in its neutered light, so the human subject is exposed, above all to herself or to himself, made aware of her and his nakedness, stripped of the inner glow of meaning and of the garments of light in the expression of Zohar, that are replaced with the nearly homonymous garments of skin, kotnot or, right? Exposure is an exile from oneself, a self-imposed exile emblazoned on one's skin, as one's skin, which in addition to its vulnerability signifies the absence of significations, the enveloping light that would be inherent to the living. At the same time, and more radically still, life is exiled from life, exposed to the other, lacking anything like a self-identity. But this immemorial exile, the excess of vivacity over itself, is what at bottom renders it living. Divine emanations are rooted in this insight, lending depth and irreducible ambiguity to exile viewed in dark mystical light. Now, speeding toward our conclusion and the discussion that I'm really looking forward to, I have promised to reflect very briefly on the ecological sense of Shekhinah, of this necessarily, in all cases, feminine, final emanation of God closest to the earth. And Shekhinah, of course, shares its roots with Shochen, with a neighbor, with neighborhood, right? So Shekhinah is really an abode. It's an abiding, the abode of something of God in and as the world. And so if I were to translate Shekhinah into Greek, I would translate it as oikos. It is really the oikos, the dwelling of ecology that we are talking about. Ecology, the word in English, is itself a late borrowing from Greek, a combination of oikos and logos, oikos being the dwelling, and logos, this notoriously difficult word to translate from Greek, but that one that can mean articulation or reason or speech, many different things. I prefer to translate ecology as the articulation of dwelling or the arrangement of a dwelling. Shekhinah is that oikos. Shekhinah is that dwelling. And later on, still in the passage that I'm discussing here from Zohar, the garden in the middle of which the tree of life grows, inseparable first from the tree of knowledge, this garden is converted into the house of the world. This is an expression from Zohar. The Garden of Eden is the house of the world, Beit Dolma in Aramaic, or to resort to Greek, again, the oikos of ecology. Likewise, hosting the tree in its center. So I quote, "This house stands in the center of all, countless doors and chambers round and round, supernal sacred sites where birds of heaven nest, each according to its species. Within emerges an immense mighty tree, its branches and fruit nourishing all." Again, this emphasis on all. "That tree climbs to the clouds of heaven. This house is saturated by it. Within, it secretes supernal hidden treasures, unknown. Thereby the house is constructed and decorated." Unquote. So the house of the world, constructed around the tree of life, deconstructs the distinction between a cultural artifact and natural phenomena. It is a house that is livable only to the extent that it is thrust open from within by the tree that grows in the middle of it. Right? So the tree is not outside the house, it's within the house. It is what makes the house livable, right? In Beitad Alma, in the house of the world, creation swings back to the middle of life, but it does not thereby overcome the exilic condition. The house is a dwelling primordially broken into, indwelt by the uncontainable and unobjectifiable. Overwhelming, saturated is the word used in Zohar. Overwhelmed by the life that flows through all its chambers and spills over beyond them. Right? The acquisition of knowledge by eating the forbidden fruit is therefore an exile from dwelling and from wisdom at the same time, from the possibility of dwelling, of being in the world, and from the possibility of wisdom. Again, Zohar here. Until Adam sinned, he ascended and abided in the supernal radiant wisdom, never parting from the tree of life. Right? And Chokhmah, of course, is the wisdom here, which is one of the names of the upper Sfirot, of the upper divine emanations. And which means that Adam really had access to the entire tree of divine emanations. But in contrast to the knowledge that he received, this wisdom, Chokhmah, was inseparable from life. And more importantly, it was not something that one takes, that one has or possesses, but it was the very abode, the dwelling place, the milieu of life. Right? That knowledge which was wisdom, as opposed to a grasping, appropriating knowledge, was of a piece with dwelling, with the milieu of life. In this sense, the abstract knowledge that weighs the values of good and evil is economic, but wisdom is ecological. Right? If we cut off the knowledge of good and evil from the tree of life, then we end up with an abstract knowledge that belongs to economy, to weighing different values, good and evil, as opposed to the ecological wisdom that is mentioned here. Now, and here I'm really at my very conclusion, the knowledge imparted by Torah is not exactly knowledge but wisdom. This is the implication of Zohar. It is another kind of approach that does not take, grasp, or appropriate reality, but in a reversal of the active and possessive impulse, is grafted onto the tree of life. And very often the Torah will be understood as Etz Chaim, as the tree of life, not only in the Zoharic tradition, but throughout Jewish tradition in its multiple manifestations. Instead of taking hold of the fruit of knowledge and squeezing it dry, extracting value or essence from it, one joins the living trunk, the trunk of life that extends from Tiferet to Yesod, these Sfirot, these emanations above Shekhinah, and one is nourished by it. That is why those versed in Torah do not grasp wisdom, as the Stanford translation suggests, one of the places where I would again correct the Stanford translation of Zohar, but occupy themselves with it. One does not grasp with wisdom, but one is preoccupied and one occupies oneself with it. Askin ba, right? Askin. So it's an occupation, almost like it's one's business, right? One is preoccupied by it without intending to lay hold of it. Our preoccupation, our care even, is far from superfluous within Zohar's cosmic ontological scheme. In line with the non-metaphysical bottom-up causality developed in this body of thought, the arousing of Torah below affects the flourishing of the tree of life above. In particular, its flourishing in continuity and in contiguity with the lowest sphira, Shekhinah, which is the tree's intricate crown branching out toward the rest of the world, facing down and branching out. The flow of life, imagined as sap circulating in the cosmic tree, is then assured and not interrupted. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
No, thank you very much, Michael. I think it was a very fascinating and inspirational reading with a lot of little gems like margaliot along the way. It's very rich, need to be digested. I would love to open the floor for questions, comments, thoughts.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
First, I enjoyed the talk very much. Uh, do you have you studied Greek?
Yeah, well, as a philosopher, I necessarily studied Greek philosophical tradition from the pre-Socratics to the late antiquity. So definitely, yes.
I have a question from someone who's very ignorant of Greek. Do you think you could summarize maybe not the difference, but a difference that you see between Hebrew and Greek? For example, because you mentioned you would translate Shekhinah to oikos.
Mm-hmm.
And I have noticed in my very limited knowledge of Greek that there's a lot of words that are very like almost animistic or they express a personality, like a human trait. So that makes me wonder what if it actually is like that, the Greek language, and what would the difference be with Hebrew, which I know Hebrew more than Greek.
Mm. Yes, that's a complex question, but of course, in terms of we can talk not only about language, but about attitudes to knowing in particular. You might know that there is a long-standing quarrel between the Jewish and the Greek approaches to the world. And what I have been trying to do in very small gestures, as Zev is mentioning, is extend bridges where the two traditions are not necessarily completely at odds with one another. To put it very schematically or broadly, the understanding is that the Greek tradition, that is the philosophical tradition, is about universalism. It's about a kind of abstract way of knowing, as opposed to the Jewish tradition, which is about particularism or a certain singularity, if one were to put it more charitably. a certain singularity and necessarily an ethical foundation for the world and for knowing that apparently one does not find in Greek thought. Of course, all of these are generalizations, and there have been lots of engagements throughout history that have sort of cross-pollinated and changed both traditions from the translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek by the 70, the Septuagint, right, by the 70 wise men in antiquity onwards. But in this particular context, the curious thing about ecology and this word oikos, which is from ancient Greek, is that ecology is a relatively modern coinage. So it does not oikologia, right? It does not exist as a term in Greek thought. It is only coined in Germany in the 19th century on the model of another Greek word, this one definitely ancient, which is oikonomia. Oikonomia is the law of the household, the law of the dwelling. And oikologie, in German, ecology in English, is made of also of two Greek words, but very late in the 19th century. I still find it very curious that the word oikos becomes the shared common ground for what we would call the ecological and economic approaches. So the idea is that the dwelling is one and the same. We all share this planetary dwelling that is one. And what differs is the ways of approaching it, the ways of organizing or being organized by it, whether imposing a law, nomos, onto the oikos, that would be the economic approach, oikonomia, the law of the household. I'm not only talking obviously about the household as an economic unit, but about the planetary household, the planetary oikos, as opposed to oikologia or ecology, a kind of a way of allowing its own articulations to flourish. The logoi, the articulations of the planetary dwelling, come to the fore here, and it's not something that one can impose at will, as one imposes a law, right? But rather this coming to the fore of these articulations. Now, at the linguistic level, I'm not sure exactly what I can say to your question, because of course, Greek and Hebrew belong to different linguistic groups. Hebrew is a Semitic language and therefore has a different way of word formation and so on and so forth. Right. And of course, beyond the linguistic peculiarities, languages open worlds. If it is not by chance that if you express something in a particular language, you express really a world that goes with that language, and these worlds are untranslatable into one another. So again, the specter maybe of Walter Benjamin is hovering over this discussion, and the task of the translator by definition fails. Why? Because a good translator is not translating a word for a word. Translators are trying to translate a world into a world, and one cannot necessarily by necessity do that, right? So we're really dealing here with two worlds of what we call antiquity, and in part they do dovetail and touch, but in other parts they do not see eye to eye at all.
I have a question quite related to this, so I want to ask it because it was precisely about this question of worlds, the plural. I found that very interesting.
Yes.
And I was wondering, I guess I'd be curious to hear more about that, but wondering like how that is played off as a tension with oneness, and also if there's kind of a anchoring of that concept either with kind of the authority of Hashem to create in general, or is this actually kind of more pinned to human transgression and our ability to complicate creations?
Yes, wonderful. An excellent question there. So oneness does not really preclude multiplicity. right? And this is the entire play. And this, when I say play, I'm not somehow trying to diminish the significance of this. It's a play that's really serious. The entire play of thinking and of being is the play of the one and the many, of analysis and synthesis, of gathering into the one and falling apart into the many, right? Therefore, they are not mutually exclusive. They necessarily belong together. And to grasp everything in its oneness is not to erase differences, is not to do away with the many, but to recognize their interconnectedness, right? That's the first point. The second point, this pluralization of worlds is very typical of the Zohar. And it also goes along with the hermeneutical approach of Zohar. So I'm reminded of a passage later on in the Zoharic exegesis where even though it deals actually with the very first phrase actually of the Hebrew Bible, Bereshit bara, right? Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. In the beginning, God created heavens and earth. Here, the writers of Zohar actually say that this is not an act that is a one-time act. First of all, even from the divine standpoint. So the heavens and the earth are constantly being recreated, and therefore they're multiple in time, right? It is not just a one-time event that happened in this mythical, let's say, history. No, it's a constant, ongoing creation of heavens and worlds. And moreover, this is the curious hermeneutical part of their observation. According to them, every interpretation of the words of Torah creates new heavens and worlds, and new heavens and earths. I'm sorry. So every interpretation of the words of the Torah is a creation of new skies and earths. And then they ask the question, but how do we know that we are creating the sky or the earth with our interpretation of the word of the Torah? And the answer, of course, is that conventional interpretations of the Hebrew Bible are creating new earths, and mystical, Kabbalistic interpretations of the Hebrew Bible, of the Torah specifically, are creating new shamayim, new skies or new heavens, right? This is the distinction that they give. And of course, here we can really draw almost a direct line to 20th century hermeneutics, all the way and even outside the Jewish tradition to Heidegger, and then to Derrida, whom they have also mentioned in his introductory remarks, right? The idea that an act of interpretation is really an act of creating a reality. It is not just an act of describing something pre-existent, but that the world itself becomes world, comes into its own without any finality to it in an act of interpretation, which is of necessity mutable, open to reinterpretation, and admitting of multiple possibilities, right?
Thank you.
Sure.
Other questions? Remarks?
Thank you very much. Really, these two past Sundays, we are in the study of the Haggadah of Pesach from the perspective from Hasidut, Kabbalistic psychoanalytic. So super amazing to hear, and we hear some of the beautiful concept about eating, about the existence or the more than exists, the separation from the Aleph, from the oneness, and you have given a lot of concept. So I do not have a question, more a request. Do you have something that I could read, that we could read? Because I knew that, I don't know, you were reading. Do you have some text or something like that?
Yes, there's a longer text on the subject that I published in a collection edited by Brianne Donaldson, titled The Knowledge of Life, I believe, is the title of that edited book. I can then share the exact source. And I have also published in a piecemeal fashion my reconstruction of the four classical elements based on the book of Zohar. So the four classical elements shared across many different cultures and traditions around the world: the earth, the air, fire, and water. I have reconstructed these based on the Zoharic outlook, and some of these have been published, and some of them are even in open access as articles. But there is something that you mentioned that I found also very curious, that separation from Aleph, right? Separation from Aleph, from that oneness. But actually, Zohar is really meditates over a number of pages on this very important and fact that we tend to overlook, which is that everything does not begin in the beginning, but everything begins with a second. Right? If you look at the first word, the first letter of the Hebrew Bible, it's Bet. It's not Aleph. Bereshit, Bet. So the beginning is already, even without that separation, the original sin, the separation of knowledge from life. From the very beginning, the beginning recedes, is absent, and everything begins with a second. And it's not by chance, because this is really consistent with a very basic insight of the Zoharic outlook, but I would say of the Kabbalistic outlook in general, which is that the upper three sfirot, the upper three divine emanations, are unknowable, right? The highest one, Ein Sof, which really we have no access to, but from which everything flows, it would be that absent Aleph. And it is this absence, right? This is the idea. This absence of the first is what allows everything to proceed and to come into being.
Okay. The other question I really would like for you to expand the knowledge about the four direction, because this is a very important. Personally, I'm working in that, and I was working on. And also, do you do some kind of lecture, or do you have some group of study group, Habruta, or something like that?
No, not really. Occasionally I give intensive seminars, and sometimes they are on Zohar and ecology in different contexts, but nothing kind of on a regular basis. If I understood your question was the substantive question was about the directions, the four directions of the world and the way they map onto the spherotic tree, right? Is that?
Yes.
Yeah, is that yes, this is very important really, because especially in my approach to the spherotic tree through the element of water, there is a way in which you can really see these flows, literally these flows of divine energies on a hydraulic model. On a hydraulic, they really flow from above down, and then they are recirculated through righteous actions and rise to the top once again. Just as water itself goes through different states depending on the temperature outside, so something like this happens with the spherotic flows on a cosmic or theoanatomical scale, I would say. So to give you an example, I already gave the example of the west being below and the east being above. But that means that to the left we have the north, and to the right we have the south. And so that means that the two lateral sfirot, Gvura and Chesed, are allocated respectively to the north and the south. Gvura belongs in the north, and therefore it's the one where the state of divine emanations is solid. The watery condition, it congeals into an ice. It's a rigidity of judgment, severity and rigidity of judgment that turns water into ice. As opposed to Chesed, or the Latin caritas, divine love, which is warm, which allows water to flow again, right? And to be water and almost to be on the edge of becoming gaseous, as it were. And so a lot of the dynamic or hydrodynamic operation of these divine energies and their flows have to do with the balancing of the different, not only of the different sphirot, but specifically in this kind of environmental or geographical sense of the different conditions in which they are found, of the cold and hot, of the north and south, of the darkness or darkening horizon of the west as opposed to the dawn of the east, right? All of these are important ways of orienting this corpus mysticum, this divine body or mystical body of God, as it were, mapped onto the different emanations. But these are just small examples. We can find many, many more where these markers of geographical location and orientation are significant for what happens within the narrative of Zohar.
Thank you very much. Sorry, thank you very much.
Yeah, I have a quick comment and a question. So the quick comment was when you mentioned oneness versus multiplicity and synthesis versus analysis, I thought about the carbon cycle.
About
this,
cycles?
the carbon cycle.
The carbon cycle.
This idea of always like synthesizing, like photosynthesis, and I mean the act of eating and breathing is like the opposite. And it's like the carbon cycle. So I drew the relationship there. My question, I'll see if I manage to phrase it. You mentioned a lot like all this abstract knowledge, emptiness, death, like a negative, and you didn't touch that much actually on what would be like the opposite or like the good. You mentioned ethics and you mentioned good deeds. And my question is, and you mentioned as well, as far as I understood, like what is like mystical and classical interpretation. And my reaction to that is that are those like ethics and mystical interpretation and classic interpretation, there is not a risk of abstract knowledge there in opposition to eating, which is a very material and physical act. I don't know if you understand my question.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you so much. There are a number of questions here, so let me try to go one by one. So the first question about that other model of knowledge that would not be abstract, that would not somehow take into oneself emptiness and death and so on. I thought I alluded to this when I said that according to the biblical text and according to Zohar's specific attention to it, the idea was that in the middle of the Garden of Eden grew the tree of knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life. And so what the writers of Zohar point out is that if it's the physical middle of the Garden of Eden, it's one point, it's one and the same point. That means that the two trees that grow there are one and the same tree. Because otherwise the text would have said that at two different points grew these two trees. But specifically, the text of the Hebrew Bible says that in the middle of the garden, in the precise middle of the garden, grew the tree of knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life, right? So the idea of eating not in separation is realizing that vital knowledge can only arise from and through life itself. So it would be the knowledge of life in the multiple senses of this genitive of life, right? It would not be a knowledge about life, turning it into an object. And here again, multiplicity is very important, not life in the abstract, but lives, different modes of living, animal, vegetal, human. and within those also multiple variations. But the idea would be, and this is why I personally feel so close to this view, in what I have called plant thinking, I have been trying to develop philosophically a knowledge of plant life that would derive from that very life itself. It's not a knowledge about plants, but the knowledge of plants, right? That I'm trying at the edge or at the limit of the possible to somehow access and participate in philosophically. Now, your second question, I think, was about the risk of when one talks about ethics as the foundation for knowing, the risk of turning that into an abstract knowledge as well. And it's true that such a risk would exist if one were to reduce ethics to something like morality, right? To an abstract system of values dictating good and bad actions, to systems of weights and measures. I talked about weighing and measuring in my talk also, to determine what is good and evil, and so on and so forth. As I see it, and I think this is consistent with the view not only of the Zohar, but of Jewish tradition more generally, what we call ethics is really something very singular. First of all, it's a figure. It's a particular figure of the tzaddik. And it is not by chance that Zohar takes as the formulaic expression of the penultimate sphira, Yesod, or foundation, this phrase from the Hebrew Bible, Tzaddik Yesod Olam, which literally means the righteous one is the foundation of the world. It is not righteousness. It is not an abstract way of thinking and acting ethically, but the righteous one. So it's a very singular figure that is impossible to really reduce or dissolve in abstract modes of knowing. This is what Jewish ethics is, and I think Emmanuel Levinas is also very aware of that. It's a very singular, embodied relation to the other that cannot be, no matter how much we try, cannot be put in these abstract formulaic terms, right? And that's why there are certain safety valves, like putting a figure, an embodied finite figure, as the foundation. I mean, it sounds completely insane and inconsistent from a philosophical point of view to take one of the divine emanations, the penultimate one, not even the last one, and to equate it to a human figure, to a figure of someone, a finite existent, a tzaddik, right? And yet there we are in the scheme of Zohar.
Thank you. Thank you for mentioning Levinas, which is not a stranger for us. We dedicated a semester for his Talmudic reading. I think Moni would like to ask a question. You're muted,
Yes.
Moni.
Yes, gracias. Hi, thank you. Okay, so I just wanna, so many things, but so there is one thing that I really don't know if this is a question or it's gonna get into a question, but I just wanna know what you think about this. But I was thinking a lot about the feminine part of Shekhinah and this connection with, I think, actually, this is something I think a lot about. So I really liked, I don't know if this is what you said or this is what I captured of what you said, but it's this, the feminine side of it, of what is femininity to me in symbolism. It's being connected, okay? And it's this kind of openness that you mentioned earlier about, how the plant, it's open for getting fed by the energy of the sun. And so this idea of the plant, the seed, the tree, there's an openness in nature that it's not looking for food. It's not looking to be fed. It's only open and it's being fed. And so I think that I was just doing this connection between this idea of femininity, of just being open and being connected to the earth, and just that is how I was thinking of how is this way of connect again and reaching open like oneness. This is why I'm saying that I don't know if this can go into a question or it's just something that blowed my mind, because I really loved how you explained it. And so this, I mean, I would love to know more. I know that we have limited time, but if there's ever another moment that we can talk more about this idea of how this symbolism or of femininity, it's completely unified with the idea of openness and just being fed. You know, this idea of nurturing is part of you know, like motherhood of feminine side, and I think that it's something that now, this is my idea, is something that we lost along the way somehow. No, where are everything that we're ingesting? Where is this coming from? Where is the connection I have with food? And so, just trying to reach this, como how to regain the oneness and the openness, more or less.
Yes, these are important comments, and I think that there's something like there is a question in there. I'm happy to expand a little bit more on this question of sexual difference within Zohar, because it doesn't only affect Shekhinah. Shekhinah is probably the only emanation or the only sphira that is almost always coded in the feminine. Sometimes she's called Malchut also, or kingdom, right? Malchut or kingdom, but also that is also in the feminine. What happens with the other sphirot is that they too can be coded in the feminine, and sometimes they are masculine. So sexual difference is completely absorbed in this divine mystical body, and not only is it absorbed there, but it is mutable. Right? Again, with the exception of Shekhinah, other sphirot can be male or female relationally. So you're absolutely right. It depends on which sphira they are relating to, and then depending on that relation, they will be in their feminine or masculine incarnation, in a sense, right? This is just to describe very generally what is going on in Zohar with regard to sexual difference. Shekhinah in particular is really, again, very rich in terms of its symbolisms, in terms of its relations to different realities. Sometimes she is called the moon with regard to Tiferet, who is the sun. The moon does not have a light of its own, it's a reflected light. Again, this idea of receiving and then sending on something else, being a conduit. So this reflection is not poverty in a sense, because it does not have its own original light, but rather it's the capacity to receive and then to send forth beyond oneself, right? To receive and to give. And in fact, to receive in order to give, right? And here I think the other issue that is really crucial is the notion of energy. Because I have been talking about emanations, divine flows, one can also think about the entire spherotic tree or the entire model that Zohar and the Kabbalistic tradition present us with as a model of divine energies, right? And this would be a term that is probably more familiar to theologians in the Christian tradition. From Gregory Palamas to especially a number of medieval and Byzantine, especially Byzantine theologians in the Christian tradition talk about divine energies, right? But definitely this is true in the book of Zohar, and we need to change the very view of what energy means based on this. And I think you, Monica, you're getting precisely to this point. Energy is not something to be appropriated and extracted from beings. Energy is what one is energized by or with when one opens oneself up to the other. Again, with this example of plants opening their leaves in order to receive solar energy and to photosynthesize, right? So it is not extracting and taking energy from somewhere. and appropriating it, but actually in this condition of what seems to be like exposure, again, with regard to galut and legalot, the two meanings of exile and exposure, through exposure to the other, one is energized. So being energized, again, even in English, this is in the passive form, and yet this is the only sustainable, as it were, ethical way of participating in energy, being energized, as opposed to accumulating, appropriating, extracting, right? All of these active forms of procuring energy, right? And eating in oneness would therefore mean also being energized, eating, being nourished at all levels of one's existence through this exposure to the other, right?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Comments, questions? Well, thank you very much, Michael, for a very generous talk. Lots of interesting ideas and fascinating point of view. So really, thank you very much. And
Yes.
we are concluding this series of 7 sessions, but please be in touch with us. We'll let you know about the event of the April 22, the Intercultural Talk about Environment. So we'll have the detail. And thank you all for being with us this evening. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Zeev, very much. Thank you, everyone. I think that both in the talk and in the discussion, it became clear that we can practice what we're talking about, really channeling this knowledge and this wisdom and this energy in order to be energized through this exposure in the discussion with others. So thank you.
Completely. Thank you very much.
Fine.
Thank you.